Some acts of kindness are so small the world never notices until someone powerful bows because of them. The traffic lights on 4th Avenue blinked through a curtain of steady rain as commuters rushed across downtown Seattle, heads lowered. Coffee cups clutched tightly against the cold October wind. Taxi horns echoed between glass office towers, while buses sighed at crowded stops, each second blending into another ordinary evening that nobody would remember. Scarlett Hayes adjusted the faded green apron beneath her thin jacket and hurried toward the crosswalk after finishing another exhausting double shift at Harbor Lane Diner. Her sneakers were soaked through, her feet ached from 10 straight hours of carrying heavy trays, and the folded cash in her pocket barely totaled enough to keep her apartment's lights on for another week. Around her, people moved with practiced indifference, each one focused on schedules, deadlines, and glowing phone screens. No one noticed the elderly woman standing alone at the edge of the intersection. She wore a long charcoal coat that looked decades old, her silver hair tucked neatly beneath a small knitted hat despite the rain. A white cane rested lightly in her hand, but instead of tapping confidently toward the street, it remained perfectly still. Cars sped past only a few feet away, while impatient drivers accelerated through yellow lights as if the city itself refused to slow down for anyone. Scarlett had already stepped into the crosswalk when something made her glance back. The woman hadn't moved. Her face remained calm, almost peaceful, yet there was no uncertainty in her posture, only quiet patience. Several pedestrians brushed past her shoulders without offering so much as a glance. One businessman nearly bumped into the cane before muttering an apology and continuing without stopping. Another woman looked directly at the elderly stranger before turning away, pretending she hadn't seen her at all. Scarlett hesitated for only a heartbeat before turning around. Her dinner plans could wait, the bus could leave without her. Rent was still due on Friday, whether she arrived home now or 20 minutes later. Some things simply mattered more. "Ma'am, would you like some help crossing?" The elderly woman tilted her head slightly toward the familiar warmth in Scarlett's voice. A faint smile touched her lips. "Only if it isn't any trouble, dear." Scarlett laughed softly. "Compared to carrying 6 plates during the lunch rush, this is the easiest thing I'll do all day." Carefully, she offered her arm instead of grabbing the woman's hand. The elderly woman accepted with surprising grace, her fingers light but steady against Scarlett's sleeve. They stepped into the crosswalk just as the signal began counting down. Rain shimmered beneath passing headlights, transforming the wet pavement into sheets of silver light. For a brief moment, the endless noise of downtown seemed to fade. Scarlett slowed her pace naturally, matching the older woman's careful steps without rushing her. "You're very kind," the woman said quietly. "People usually assume kindness takes too much time." Scarlett shrugged. "My grandma always said everybody's in a hurry until it's someone they love standing alone." The elderly woman grew silent. Her gentle smile deepened almost imperceptibly. Less than a mile away, inside a convoy of black luxury vehicles moving silently through Seattle's financial district, several security specialists spoke urgently into encrypted radios after discovering that someone they had been searching for all afternoon had vanished from every surveillance camera in the city. Unfortunately for Scarlett, she had no idea that dozens of highly trained people were desperately looking for the woman now walking calmly beside her. To Scarlett, she was simply someone's grandmother trying to cross a busy street before the light changed. They reached the opposite sidewalk just as the countdown reached 0. Scarlett waited until both feet were safely on the curb before letting go. "There you are," she said warmly. "Mission accomplished." The elderly woman slowly reached into her coat pocket and removed an old silver ring engraved with a crest Scarlett didn't recognize. Instead of offering it as payment, she gently closed Scarlett's fingers around it for only a second before taking it back. "No," the woman whispered with quiet certainty. "Not yet." Scarlett blinked, confused. Before she could ask what those words meant, a long black limousine rolled silently to the curb across the street, and every person wearing dark suits nearby suddenly lowered their heads at exactly the same moment. Scarlett remained frozen on the sidewalk as the black limousine came to a silent stop beneath the glow of a street lamp. Rain continued falling in soft sheets, blurring the polished windows until they reflected nothing but shifting city lights. She looked from the elderly woman to the vehicle, expecting a chauffeur or perhaps concerned family members to rush forward. Instead, 4 men in perfectly tailored black coats stepped out in complete silence. Their movements were calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. None of them looked at Scarlett first. Every one of them lowered his head toward the elderly woman with unmistakable respect before the tallest among them spoke in a measured voice. "We have been looking everywhere for you, ma'am." The woman smiled as though she had merely returned from an afternoon stroll. "I needed fresh air." The man nodded once without questioning her explanation. Scarlett shifted awkwardly, suddenly, feeling as though she had wandered into a moment that did not belong to her. "Well," she said with an embarrassed smile, "I am glad someone found you. I should probably catch my bus before the next one leaves." The elderly woman turned towards Scarlett again. Although her cloudy eyes revealed no sight, her face somehow carried the unmistakable feeling of recognition. "Scarlett Hayes," she said gently. Scarlett blinked. "I do not remember telling you my name." A quiet smile crossed the woman's face. "Perhaps you did not." Before Scarlett could ask another question, one of the men stepped forward holding a folded umbrella over the elderly woman's shoulders. Another opened the limousine door without making a sound. The strange elegance of the entire scene made Scarlett feel as though she had accidentally stepped into another world hidden inside the ordinary streets of Seattle. The elderly woman reached into her coat pocket once more and removed a simple cream-colored card with no company logo, no phone number, and no address. Only a name was printed neatly across the center in dark ink. Scarlett accepted it with a puzzled expression. "What is this?" she asked. "An invitation," the woman answered softly. "If someone delivers another one tomorrow, I hope you will accept it." Scarlett laughed politely. "I think somebody has mistaken me for someone much more important." "No," the woman replied. "That is exactly why it belongs to you." Without another word, she stepped gracefully into the waiting limousine. The doors closed almost silently. Seconds later, the long black vehicle disappeared into evening traffic as smoothly as it had arrived, leaving Scarlett standing alone beneath the rain with the mysterious card still resting in her hand. She looked down again. There was still only one name printed across its surface. Nothing else. No explanation. No clue. She slipped it into her apron pocket before finally hurrying toward the bus stop, convincing herself that the entire encounter had simply been one of those strange moments that cities occasionally created. The following morning began exactly like every other Tuesday. The bell above the diner door chimed every few minutes as regular customers ordered coffee before work. The smell of fresh bacon and pancakes filled the small restaurant, while classic rock drifted quietly from an old speaker near the kitchen. Scarlett tied her apron, balanced 3 coffee mugs along one arm, and smiled through another busy breakfast rush. By 10 o'clock, she had almost forgotten about the elderly woman. Almost. Every now and then her fingers brushed against the mysterious card inside her pocket, reminding her that yesterday had actually happened. Around 11:30, the front door opened again. A man wearing a charcoal overcoat entered alone. He appeared to be in his early 50s, with neatly combed grey hair and polished leather shoes untouched by the rain outside. He was not dressed like anyone who usually visited Harbor Lane Diner. He quietly ordered black coffee, thanked Scarlett by name before she introduced herself, and placed a thick ivory envelope on the table beside the untouched cup. "This belongs to you," Scarlett frowned. "How do you know my name?" "Because someone asked me to make certain that this reached the correct person." He stood before she could ask another question, leaving enough cash to cover the coffee he never drank. By the time Scarlett reached the front window, only seconds later, he had already disappeared into the crowd outside. Her heartbeat quickened as she looked back toward the envelope. Heavy cream paper, dark green wax seal, an unfamiliar crest pressed carefully into the center. She slowly turned it over and noticed one sentence written across the back in elegant handwriting. "We would be honored by your presence tomorrow evening." The address printed beneath it was unlike anything she had ever seen before, and what Scarlett did not know was that, by accepting that invitation, she would soon walk through doors that almost no ordinary human had ever been allowed to enter. Scarlett spent the entire next day trying to convince herself that accepting the invitation was a mistake. Every practical thought told her to throw the envelope away, finish her evening shift, and forget that any of this had ever happened. Yet every time she remembered the elderly woman's gentle voice or the strange respect shown by the people around her, curiosity quietly returned. By 6 o'clock, the autumn sky above Seattle had already faded into deep shades of blue, and the city lights reflected across Elliott Bay like scattered stars. Scarlett changed into the nicest dress she owned, a simple navy blue one she had worn only twice before, brushed the rain from her old coat. The address led far beyond the busy streets she knew so well. Glass towers slowly disappeared behind rows of towering evergreens until the neighborhoods grew quieter, wealthier, and strangely untouched by the constant noise of downtown. 20 minutes later, the bus stopped at the end of a private road. Scarlett stepped onto the sidewalk and stared ahead in disbelief. Iron gates nearly 15 feet tall stood silently beneath ancient stone pillars covered with climbing ivy. Beyond them, she could barely make out the silhouette of an enormous estate resting among towering cedar trees. Warm lights glowed through tall windows, giving the entire property the appearance somehow hidden in the Pacific Northwest. Before Scarlett could even wonder how to announce herself, the gates began opening without a sound. No guard approached. No speaker demanded identification. It was as though someone had already been expecting her. She hesitated only briefly before walking forward along a stone driveway lined with carefully trimmed hedges and flickering lanterns. The farther she walked, the quieter everything became. Even the sounds of the city seemed to disappear behind the trees. The only thing she could hear was the steady rhythm of her own footsteps against damp stone. The front entrance opened before she reached it. A distinguished gentleman wearing an immaculate black suit greeted her with a respectful nod. "Miss Hayes, welcome." Scarlett looked around awkwardly. "I think there has been some misunderstanding. I am only here because someone delivered an invitation." "There has been no misunderstanding," the man answered with perfect spected. He stepped aside, inviting her inside. Scarlett entered cautiously, immediately struck by the warmth of the enormous entrance hall. Marble floors reflected the glow of crystal chandeliers while towering bookshelves stretched toward intricately carved ceilings. Classical music floated softly through hidden speakers, blending with the quiet conversations of elegantly dressed guests gathering throughout the mansion. Men in tailored tuxedos and women in evening gowns moved with remarkable grace. Each conversation conducted in gentle voices that somehow never disturbed the peaceful atmosphere. Scarlett instinctively looked down at her modest dress, suddenly feeling hopelessly out of place. Yet something unexpected happened. No one stared, no one whispered. Every member of the staff greeted her with the quiet respect shown to every other guest. A young attendant accepted her coat with a warm smile before offering a small silver tray holding sparkling water. "Please make yourself comfortable," she said politely. "The evening will begin shortly." Scarlett wandered through the grand hall, admiring paintings that looked centuries old and sculptures carved with astonishing detail. Some of the portraits displayed men and women whose pale faces carried expressions of quiet authority, their eyes following visitors with almost unsettling realism. She paused in front of one large painting featuring a regal couple standing beneath a moonlit sky. The man's silver eyes seemed strangely familiar, although she could not remember where she had seen that expression before. "Beautiful, are they not?" an older gentleman beside her commented. Scarlett smiled politely. "They almost look alive." The man gave a thoughtful nod. Some legacies never truly disappear. Before she could ask what he meant, the lights throughout the mansion dimmed slightly. Every conversation ended almost instantly. Glasses were lowered onto nearby tables. Musicians stopped playing in perfect unison. Hundreds of guests turned their attention toward the sweeping staircase overlooking the ballroom. Scarlett followed their gaze. At that exact moment, less than 30 feet above her, a tall man dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit stepped into view. He carried himself with effortless confidence, saying nothing as he rested one hand lightly against the polished railing. The room remained completely silent. Scarlett did not know his name, did not understand why every person present seemed unable to look away, and could not explain why the atmosphere itself suddenly felt heavier. What she also did not know was that while everyone else in the ballroom had come to witness their king, the only person that man's calm grey eyes searched for was the young waitress standing quietly near the portrait below. The silence inside the ballroom lingered several long seconds after the tall man appeared at the top of the staircase. No announcement introduced him, no orchestra welcomed him, yet somehow his quiet presence commanded more attention than any speech ever could. Scarlett watched as he descended with measured, unhurried steps, every movement calm enough to seem effortless. His black suit fit with flawless precision, and the polished marble beneath his shoes reflected the soft amber glow of the chandeliers overhead. What caught Scarlett's attention most were his eyes. Even from across the room, they carried an unusual shade of pale grey that seemed almost silver beneath the lights, calm yet impossibly observant. Guests respectfully stepped aside without being asked. creating a clear path through the ballroom while conversations remained suspended in complete silence. Scarlett instinctively took half a step backward, assuming someone that important would never notice an ordinary waitress standing quietly near the edge of the room. She turned her attention toward a nearby display of antique books, hoping to disappear into the crowd. "First time here?" a cheerful voice asked beside her. Scarlett looked up to see a smiling woman, wearing an elegant emerald dress holding 2 crystal glasses filled with sparkling water. "Is it that obvious?" Scarlett answered with an embarrassed laugh. "Only because I remember feeling exactly the same during my first invitation." The woman handed Scarlett one of the glasses. "Relax. Everyone spends the first 15 minutes wondering whether they belong here." Scarlett smiled gratefully. "I am still trying to figure out why I was invited at all. Sometimes this house notices people before they notice themselves." Before Scarlett could ask what that meant, a gentle chime echoed through the ballroom. The elegant guests slowly dispersed into neighboring galleries as attendants quietly guided small groups toward different wings of the estate. There was no confusion, no raised voices, only smooth coordination that felt almost instinctive. Scarlett found herself following a handful of visitors into an expansive library filled with towering walnut shelves and enormous windows overlooking dark evergreen forest beyond the estate. Hundreds of leather-bound books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. An enormous fireplace crackled softly, filling the room with comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the cool autumn night outside. An elderly librarian welcomed the group and explained that the estate preserved historical collections unavailable anywhere else in the country. Scarlett wandered naturally toward one display featuring journals donated by ordinary citizens throughout American history. Unlike the priceless artwork surrounding them, these handwritten notebooks contained simple stories about neighbors helping neighbors, families rebuilding after disasters, teachers inspiring children to perform quiet acts of generosity. Scarlett smiled as she carefully turned one page protected beneath museum glass. "These are my favorite," she whispered almost to herself. "They remind people that history is not only written by famous names." A voice behind her answered almost immediately, "An unusual observation." Scarlett turned and found herself standing only a few feet away from the same silver-eyed man who had descended the staircase earlier. Up close, he appeared younger than she had expected, perhaps in his early 30s, although there was something timeless about the calm confidence in his posture. His expression remained composed, neither cold nor particularly warm, simply attentive. Scarlett instinctively straightened. "I hope I was not speaking too loudly." "Not at all," he replied. His voice was low and steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard without ever raising it. "Most visitors come here to admire paintings worth millions of dollars. You stopped to read forgotten journals." Scarlett glanced back toward the display. "Expensive things are impressive. Ordinary kindness is unforgettable." For the briefest moment, something almost impossible crossed the man's face. It disappeared so quickly, Scarlett wondered whether she had imagined it. It was not closer to recognition. He looked toward the journal beneath the glass before asking, "Do you always stop for strangers?" Scarlett laughed softly. "Only when they need someone, even if there is nothing to gain, especially then." The man's gaze lingered on her for another quiet second before a distinguished attendant approached him with a respectful bow. "Sir, the council has assembled." He nodded once without taking his eyes completely off Scarlett. "Please excuse me." Scarlett watched him disappear through an arched doorway surrounded by several formally dressed attendants. The librarian quietly stepped beside her with a knowing smile. "You made quite an impression." Scarlett looked puzzled. "Who was he?" The librarian paused for only a heartbeat before answering carefully, "Someone whose attention is not easily earned." At that exact moment, several floors above the library, the elderly woman Scarlett had helped cross the street quietly entered a private chamber without her white cane, her posture suddenly straighter than before. Looking toward the silver-eyed man waiting beside the window, she smiled gently and asked, "Well, Sebastian, after all these years, have you finally found someone who still chooses kindness before curiosity?" Scarlett remained in the library long after the silver-eyed man disappeared through the arched doorway. His questions had been simple, yet they lingered in her thoughts with unusual weight. She had met wealthy business owners before while serving tables at charity dinners, but none of them had ever seemed genuinely interested in why an ordinary waitress believed kindness mattered. Around her, Guests gradually drifted toward another wing of the estate as attendants quietly invited everyone to continue the evening gathering. Scarlett followed at a comfortable distance, passing beneath vaulted ceilings decorated with hand-painted constellations and elegant bronze chandeliers that cast warm pools of light across polished stone floors. Every hallway revealed another glimpse of remarkable craftsmanship, yet nothing felt designed merely to impress. Instead, the estate carried an atmosphere of quiet history, as though every room had witnessed generations of conversations that had shaped lives beyond its walls. An attendant opened a pair of carved wooden doors leading into a sunroom surrounded by towering glass walls. Beyond them, moonlight rested gently across perfectly maintained gardens where fountains whispered beneath ancient maple trees glowing with autumn colors. Small groups of guests gathered around round tables enjoying desserts and quiet conversation. Scarlett accepted a cup of hot tea offered by one of the servers, silently appreciating its warmth after the chilly walk from the bus stop. She recognized several members of the staff from earlier in the evening. Every one of them smiled politely, yet there remained an unusual consistency in the way they observed the room. Nobody hurried, nobody interrupted another person's conversation. Every movement seemed guided by invisible rules that Scarlett could feel but not understand. As she wandered toward the garden doors, she noticed an elderly groundskeeper carefully collecting fallen maple leaves by hand instead of using the modern equipment resting nearby. Curious, she stepped outside. "Would you like a little help?" she asked with a friendly smile. The groundskeeper looked surprised. "You are a guest, miss. You do not need to trouble yourself." Scarlett gently picked up a nearby wicker basket anyway. "My grandmother always said leaves never ask who owns the yard." The old man chuckled warmly. Together they gathered bright red and golden leaves while the fountain continued its quiet song nearby. Neither of them noticed several guests watching discreetly through the glass walls inside the mansion. One elegantly dressed woman folded her arms. "She keeps doing it," she murmured, without realizing anyone is watching. A third quietly replied, "That is precisely the point." Scarlett finished filling the basket before handing it back to the grateful groundskeeper. "There you go. Thank you," he said sincerely. "Most visitors only notice the flowers. Flowers are beautiful because somebody keeps caring for them every day," Scarlett answered before returning inside. As she entered the main corridor again, she found herself standing beside the silver-eyed man once more. This time he was alone, studying an enormous stained glass window that overlooked the gardens below. Colored moonlight spilled across the marble floor between them. He glanced toward the basket of leaves, still resting near the doorway. "You were helping the groundskeeper?" Scarlett looked slightly embarrassed. "It only took a few minutes. You have said something similar twice tonight." She smiled. "Helping usually does not take as long as people imagine." He considered her words quietly. "Many people measure value by time. Maybe they should measure it by whether somebody needed them." Silence settled comfortably between them. Outside, a gentle breeze carried another shower of maple leaves across the garden paths. The man looked toward the window before speaking again. "There is a formal gathering beginning shortly. Certain traditions are observed. If you notice people behaving differently than expected, do not be alarmed." Scarlett laughed softly. "I've spent the entire evening trying not to look alarmed." For the first time since she had met him, the corners of his mouth lifted into the faintest hint of a smile. It transformed his reserved expression for only an instant before footsteps echoed through the corridor. An attendant approached respectfully. "The ceremonial hall is prepared." The silver-eyed man gave a quiet nod. "Thank you." He looked back towards Scarlett one final time. "Miss Hayes, whatever happens during the next hour, simply trust what you have already seen with your own eyes." Before Scarlett could ask what he meant, the great bronze doors at the end of the corridor slowly began to open. Beyond them stretched an enormous ceremonial chamber illuminated by hundreds of candles, where rows of distinguished guests had already risen to their feet in complete silence. Waiting for someone whose arrival had not yet been announced, Scarlett paused just inside the entrance of the ceremonial hall, instinctively slowing her steps as though she had crossed an invisible boundary. The room stretched farther than she had imagined, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into soft shadows above rows of towering stone columns. Hundreds of candles flickered along the walls, their reflections dancing across polished marble that seemed untouched by time. There was no orchestra, no speeches. Only the quiet crackle of candlelight and the gentle rustle of formal attire as every guest remained standing in complete silence. The atmosphere carried the weight of tradition, but not intimidation. It felt more like entering a place where every movement already possessed meaning. An attendant quietly guided Scarlett toward the final row, where several unoccupied chairs overlooked the center aisle. She noticed that every seat faced a raised platform at the opposite end of the chamber, although no throne stood there. Instead, a single wooden chair rested beneath an enormous stained glass window depicting a silver moon rising above dark evergreen forests. The simplicity of the chair contrasted sharply with the grandeur surrounding it. Scarlett leaned slightly toward the elegantly dressed woman seated beside her. "Is someone giving a speech?" she whispered. The woman smiled politely without taking her eyes from the front of the room. "No, tonight is about gratitude." Before Scarlett could ask another question, a soft bell echoed once through the chamber. The sound was gentle, yet every person present responded immediately. Hundreds of guests lowered their heads together, not dramatically, but with practiced respect. Scarlett hesitated before awkwardly following their example. Footsteps echoed from somewhere beyond the great bronze doors behind the platform. Slow, measured, unhurried. The doors opened without a sound. Scarlett lifted her eyes just enough to see several attendants enter first. Dressed in the same understated black attire she had seen throughout the estate, they formed two quiet lines along the aisle before stepping aside. Then the elderly woman appeared. She wore the same charcoal coat Scarlett remembered from the rainy Seattle intersection, yet everything about her presence felt different inside the candlelit hall. She no longer carried the white cane. Her posture was perfectly steady as she walked with calm confidence toward the simple wooden chair. No one announced her arrival, no one applauded. Instead, every guest lowered their heads even farther as she passed. Scarlett's heart skipped. She looked around the enormous chamber, searching for an explanation. The elderly librarian from earlier stood near one of the columns with his hands respectfully folded. The groundskeeper she had helped in the garden had also stopped working and now stood quietly among the assembled guests. Every attendant, every server, every distinguished visitor offered the same silent gesture of respect. Scarlett realized she was the only person still looking directly at the elderly woman. Confused, she slowly lowered her own gaze as well, uncertain whether she was following etiquette or simply following everyone else. The elderly woman reached the wooden chair but did not sit immediately. Instead, she turned slowly, her gentle expression traveling across the faces filling the chamber. Her cloudy eyes still suggested blindness, yet somehow Scarlett felt as though the older woman saw every person present with remarkable clarity. "Thank you," the elderly woman said softly. Her voice carried effortlessly through the silent hall without microphones or ceremony. Kindness has always survived because ordinary people continue choosing it when no reward can be seen. Scarlett felt those words settle deep inside her chest. They sounded less like a speech and more like a memory being shared. The elderly woman finally took her seat. At that exact moment, another set of footsteps echoed from the opposite side of the hall. Scarlett looked up instinctively. The silver-eyed man entered alone through a side doorway, dressed in the same immaculate black suit, his expression composed as always. Unlike every other person in the chamber, he remained standing while everyone else continued with heads respectfully lowered. He walked only halfway down the center aisle before stopping. For several long seconds, he simply looked toward the elderly woman without speaking. Scarlett glanced around the room again, expecting someone to explain what was happening. No one moved, no one whispered. The silence itself seemed to be waiting. Then something even stranger happened. Every guest in the hall slowly lowered to one knee in perfect unison before the elderly woman. Scarlett froze in disbelief, her eyes widening as she realized she was now the only person left standing. And before she could decide whether she should follow them, the silver-eyed man quietly turned his face toward her instead. Scarlett could feel every heartbeat in the silent chamber as hundreds of kneeling guests waited without lifting their eyes. She remained standing not out of defiance, but because she genuinely did not understand what was expected of her. The silver-eyed man held her gaze for one long, unreadable moment before calmly changing direction. Instead of continuing toward the raised platform, he walked directly toward Scarlett. His polished shoes echoed softly across the marble floor, each measured step making the enormous hall seem even quieter. Scarlett instinctively glanced around, wondering whether she should move aside, but every person remained perfectly still. Even the attendants lowered their eyes. She whispered the first thought that came to mind. "I think I am standing in the wrong place." The man stopped only a few feet away. His expression remained composed, yet there was unmistakable warmth beneath the calm restraint in his silver eyes. "No," he answered quietly. You are exactly where you should be. Scarlet felt her pulse quicken. I still do not understand why I am here. He nodded gently, as though he had expected that answer from the beginning. You helped an elderly woman cross a busy street during rush hour. Scarlet blinked in confusion. That cannot possibly be why all of this is happening. It is not because you helped her cross the street, he replied. It is because you never asked who she was before deciding she deserved your time. The words settled over the chamber with remarkable stillness. Scarlet looked toward the elderly woman sitting peacefully beneath the stained glass window. The older woman smiled with unmistakable affection before folding her hands comfortably in her lap. Who is she? Scarlet finally asked. For the first time that evening, the silver-eyed man looked toward the woman before answering. His voice carried quietly through the chamber, clear enough for every guest to hear. Her name is Eleanor. He paused respectfully before continuing. She is the woman who raised me. A ripple of quiet emotion moved through the gathered guests. Although no one broke protocol, Scarlet slowly looked back at him. Raised you? Yes. His eyes never left hers. Long before I carried any title, long before this estate became my responsibility. She taught me that power means very little unless it serves someone weaker. Scarlet searched his face, trying to connect the reserved man standing before her with everything she had witnessed since entering the estate. Then, who are you? Silence returned. It lasted only seconds, yet it felt as though the entire room had been waiting for this single question. The elderly woman answered before he could. His name is Sebastian Vitelli. She smiled softly. And he is the Vampire King. Scarlet's breath caught. Every strange moment suddenly rearranged itself inside her mind. The silent respect, the mysterious invitation, the portraits, the careful traditions, even the extraordinary calm that surrounded him now made a different kind of sense. She stared at Sebastian, expecting the revelation to somehow change the man standing before her. It did not. He remained exactly as she had met him in the library, quiet, observant, unhurried. You are looking at me differently, he said gently. Scarlet shook her head after only a moment. I am trying not to. Something unexpectedly softened in his expression. Why? Because before I knew your title, you were simply a man asking thoughtful questions about kindness. The faint smile returned to his face, lasting slightly longer than before. Around the chamber, several older members of the court exchanged surprised glances. They had watched kings receive admiration, fear, obedience, and endless praise across generations. Almost none of them had ever heard someone answer their ruler with such unaffected honesty. Eleanor slowly rose from her chair. Every kneeling guest lowered their heads even farther. She turned toward Sebastian with unmistakable pride. You once asked me how you would recognize genuine goodness after living long enough to doubt it. Sebastian gave a quiet nod. I remember. Eleanor looked toward Scarlet. You recognize it because it appears exactly the same whether anyone important is watching or not. Scarlet lowered her eyes, suddenly embarrassed by so much attention. I only did what anyone should have done. Several people in the chamber quietly smiled at those words. Sebastian stepped one pace closer, his voice calm enough that only those nearest could fully hear it. That is precisely why almost no one did. Then, before anyone could anticipate his next movement, the ruler whom every person in the chamber had honored with absolute respect slowly lowered himself before the young waitress, bowing his head in silent gratitude as the entire court watched in complete astonishment. For several endless seconds, no one in the ceremonial hall moved. Hundreds of distinguished guests remained frozen exactly where they were, their eyes fixed upon the impossible sight unfolding before them. The Vampire King still stood with his head respectfully bowed before an ordinary waitress from Seattle. The candlelight shimmered across the marble floor, while absolute silence filled every corner of the chamber. Scarlet's heart pounded so loudly she wondered if everyone else could hear it. She took one uncertain step backward. Please, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You do not have to do this. Sebastian slowly lifted his head, meeting her eyes with the same quiet composure that had never left him throughout the evening. That is precisely why I must. Scarlet searched his face, hoping someone would explain that this was part of a ceremony she had accidentally interrupted. Instead, Eleanor rose from her chair and approached them with calm, measured steps. Although she no longer carried her white cane, she gently rested one hand against Scarlet's arm, exactly as she had while crossing the rainy intersection. Child, Eleanor said warmly, gratitude loses its meaning when it is measured by status. Scarlet looked around the hall. Everyone is staring, Eleanor smiled. Not because you embarrassed anyone, they are witnessing something they have not seen in many generations. Sebastian straightened and quietly turned toward the assembled court. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the chamber. There exists an oath older than every stone in this estate. He allowed the words to settle before continuing. It was established long before I inherited this responsibility. Any person who protects the guardian of this house without seeking recognition shall forever receive the gratitude of this court. Scarlett frowned slightly. Guardian? Eleanor answered before Sebastian could speak. Titles have changed throughout the centuries. Some have called me advisor. Others called me teacher. The only title that ever mattered to me was caretaker. She gently squeezed Scarlett's hand. Long before Sebastian learned how to lead others, he first learned how to care because someone cared for him. Scarlett slowly looked toward Sebastian again. She remembered the journals in the library, the gardens, the groundskeeper, the careful traditions that valued quiet service over public praise. None of those moments had been random. They had all pointed toward the same lesson without revealing it completely. So this evening, she said softly, was never about me. Sebastian gave a faint shake of his head. It was never about proving that you were extraordinary. He paused. It was about reminding everyone else that goodness still exists in ordinary places. A quiet murmur moved gently through the gathered guests. Not disagreement, but thoughtful reflection. Several older members of the court exchanged respectful glances before lowering their heads again. Scarlett noticed many of them watching her with warmth instead of curiosity now. She felt less like an outsider and more like someone unexpectedly welcomed into a tradition she had never known existed. Eleanor slowly guided Scarlett toward a nearby window overlooking the moonlit gardens. Beyond the glass, maple leaves drifted gently across winding stone paths while fountains reflected silver light beneath the autumn sky. "Do you know why I walked through Seattle alone?" Eleanor asked. Scarlett hesitated. "I assumed you wanted fresh air." Eleanor laughed softly. That was true. But I also wanted to remember whether people still noticed one another. She looked toward the quiet city lights visible beyond the trees. Power has a strange habit of surrounding itself with protection. Eventually, nobody knows whether kindness is offered to the person or to the position they hold. Scarlett thought back to the rainy intersection. She remembered businessmen rushing past, strangers avoiding eye contact, people pretending not to notice an elderly woman waiting patiently beside heavy traffic. "I never thought about it that way," she admitted. "Most people do not," Eleanor replied. "That is why moments like yours matter." Sebastian joined them beside the window, leaving several respectful feet of space between himself and Scarlett. "When my security team discovered she had disappeared yesterday," he said quietly, "they believed she had been placed in danger." Scarlett looked surprised. "They were searching for her?" "Across the entire city." Scarlett smiled gently toward Eleanor. "You were simply enjoying a walk." Eleanor's eyes sparkled with quiet amusement. "Sometimes the safest place in the world is beside a kind stranger." Before Scarlett could answer, one of the senior attendants approached Sebastian with a respectful bow. "Your Majesty," he said carefully. "The council respectfully requests permission to address the court regarding tonight's ceremony." Sebastian looked toward Scarlett before returning his attention to the attendant. Then he calmly added words that caused several members of the court to lift their heads in visible surprise. "Miss Hayes will remain beside me when the council speaks." The ceremonial hall remained silent as Sebastian and Scarlett walked side by side toward the front of the chamber. Neither of them spoke. The only sound came from quiet footsteps echoing across polished marble beneath hundreds of steady candle flames. Scarlett could feel countless eyes following her, yet the expressions she noticed were no longer filled with surprise alone. Some reflected curiosity, others carried quiet admiration. A few revealed cautious uncertainty. She understood why. Just 1 hour earlier she had been serving coffee inside a neighborhood diner. Now she stood beside a ruler whose presence alone had commanded the respect of an entire hidden society. The contrast felt almost impossible to accept. Sebastian stopped near the center of the platform while Scarlett instinctively remained one respectful step behind him. Before she could quietly move farther away, he turned slightly toward her. "Please remain where you are." She lowered her voice. "I do not belong at the front of the room." "Tonight," he answered calmly, "you stand here because of your actions, not because of your position." Those simple words settled over the chamber with remarkable clarity. Several members of the court exchanged thoughtful glances, but no one interrupted. Moments later, 3 senior council members approached from opposite sides of the hall. Each wore understated formal attire rather than elaborate ceremonial clothing. reinforcing the quiet dignity that seemed to define everything within the estate. The eldest among them, an elderly gentleman with neatly combed silver hair, respectfully inclined his head toward Eleanor before addressing Sebastian. "Your Majesty, no one questions the ancient oath. Every member of this court honors it." He paused carefully before continuing. "However, tradition has rarely required such a public expression before someone completely unfamiliar with our world." Scarlett immediately understood that the concern was not directed toward her personally. It was directed toward the unexpected situation itself. Before Sebastian could answer, she quietly stepped forward. "May I say something?" The council members looked toward Sebastian. He gave a single approving nod. Scarlett faced the gathering with visible humility. "I believe there has been a misunderstanding. I never expected recognition. I helped someone because she needed help. That is all." She smiled gently before continuing. "If tonight has created difficulty for your traditions, then perhaps the easiest solution is for everyone to simply remember the lesson and forget about me." A gentle silence followed. Several council members looked genuinely surprised by her response. She had been offered extraordinary honor, yet the first thing she suggested was removing herself from the center of attention. Eleanor's warm smile quietly widened. Sebastian watched Scarlett for several thoughtful seconds before turning toward the council once more. "You feared that gratitude shown publicly might weaken tradition." His calm voice carried effortlessly through the hall. "Instead, Miss Hayes has demonstrated the very principle our tradition was created to protect." He slowly looked across the assembled guests. Humility cannot be taught by speeches. It must be witnessed. The eldest council member lowered his eyes briefly in reflection. "Your Majesty, perhaps we have been guarding the ceremony more carefully than its purpose." Sebastian nodded almost imperceptibly. "Exactly." Scarlett remained quietly beside him, uncertain whether she had said the right thing. The tension she had sensed moments earlier gradually softened throughout the room. Conversations did not begin. No applause followed. Instead, one by one, the members of the court gently inclined their heads toward Scarlett. It was not the dramatic gesture Sebastian had offered earlier. It was something quieter, something more personal, a simple acknowledgement that kindness deserved respect regardless of where it appeared. Scarlett felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment. She lowered her own head in return. "Thank you," she said softly, "but tomorrow morning I still have to be at the diner by 7. A few quiet smiles spread throughout the chamber. Even several council members allowed themselves a gentle laugh. Sebastian looked at her with unmistakable admiration. "That answer," he said, "is exactly why none of this will change who you are." Eleanor stepped forward once more, resting one hand lightly against Scarlett's shoulder. "There is one final tradition remaining before this evening ends." Scarlett looked toward her with quiet curiosity. "Another ceremony?" Eleanor shook her head with a gentle smile. "No, merely a conversation." She turned toward Sebastian, the library. "Just the three of us." As the guests slowly began leaving the ceremonial hall in respectful silence, Scarlett glanced once more toward the towering stained glass window where moonlight poured into the chamber. She had entered the estate believing she had accepted an invitation to an elegant gathering. She was leaving the ceremony realizing she had unknowingly become part of a story that had begun long before she was born, and the conversation waiting inside the library would finally reveal why Eleanor had chosen that rainy Seattle crosswalk on that ordinary autumn afternoon. The library felt even quieter than before. Most of the candles had burned lower, filling the vast room with warm amber light that danced across endless shelves of leather-bound books. Outside the towering windows, the gardens rested beneath a clear autumn sky, while a cool breeze carried golden maple leaves across winding stone paths. Scarlett followed Eleanor through the familiar room until they reached a circular table positioned beside the enormous fireplace. 3 porcelain cups of tea had already been prepared, as though someone had anticipated this meeting hours in advance. Sebastian waited until Eleanor was comfortably seated before taking the chair across from her. Scarlett hesitated before sitting in the remaining seat, still uncertain whether she truly belonged among them. For a few peaceful moments, nobody spoke. The crackling fireplace filled the silence naturally, allowing the weight of the evening to settle. Eleanor wrapped both hands around her teacup before smiling gently at Scarlett. "You have been wondering why I chose to walk alone yesterday." Scarlett nodded. "Ever since I arrived." Eleanor looked into the dancing firelight. "For many years I traveled quietly through cities without introducing myself. Sometimes people stopped. Most of the time they did not. I never judged them." Everyone carries burdens that cannot be seen. She lifted her eyes again, but every once in a while someone would notice another human being before noticing the inconvenience. Scarlett lowered her gaze toward the steaming tea. I still think almost anyone would have helped, Sebastian answered softly. Our security cameras recorded 143 people passing that intersection before you arrived. Scarlett slowly looked up. That many? Not one of them stopped. The room became quiet again. Scarlett thought back to the endless stream of umbrellas, briefcases, headphones, and hurried footsteps that had surrounded the elderly woman. She remembered believing she had simply been the first person to notice. Now she understood she had only been the first person who chose to pause. Eleanor smiled kindly, sensing the realization settling inside Scarlett. The world often teaches people to protect their time more carefully than their compassion. Scarlett sighed gently. I never imagined one small decision could matter so much. Sebastian rested one hand lightly against the edge of the table. Small decisions reveal permanent character. His calm voice carried no exaggeration. Grand gestures are easy when everyone is watching. Character is measured when nobody expects anything in return. Scarlett found herself smiling despite the overwhelming evening. I wish the customers at my diner believed that. Eleanor laughed softly, the warm sound filling the library with unexpected familiarity. Tell me about your diner. Scarlett blinked in surprise. There is not much to tell, then begin there. Scarlett relaxed a little. She described the early morning coffee regulars who always sat at the same counter stools, the retired school teacher who left encouraging notes for exhausted college students, the construction workers who secretly paid for meals when struggling families came through the door, and the elderly couple who shared one slice of pie every Friday because they insisted it tasted better together. She spoke naturally, forgetting for a while that she sat across from a king. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his attention never drifting. When she finished, he quietly observed, "You remember people by their kindness, not their professions." Scarlett shrugged with a modest smile. Those are usually the parts worth remembering. Eleanor looked proudly toward Sebastian. Do you understand now? He gave a thoughtful nod. More clearly than I expected. Scarlett looked between them. Understand what? Sebastian answered honestly. For centuries I believed extraordinary people would change the world. His expression softened almost imperceptibly. Tonight you reminded me that ordinary people quietly change it every single day. Scarlett felt unexpectedly emotional, not because of the compliment itself, but because he seemed to believe every word. She looked toward the towering shelves surrounding them. If that is true, then there must be thousands of stories in this room that nobody outside these walls has ever heard. Eleanor smiled. Exactly. She reached beneath the table and carefully placed a beautifully bound journal before Scarlett. Its dark blue leather cover was completely blank except for a single silver bookmark. Is this? Scarlett asked. An empty volume, Eleanor replied. Every generation adds one more story worth preserving. Scarlett gently touched the cover but did not open it. I have not done anything important enough to belong in a library like this. Sebastian looked directly at her. The greatest mistake people make is believing history belongs only to remarkable lives. He paused before adding quietly, sometimes history begins with a waitress who simply refused to let a stranger cross the street alone. Scarlett sat quietly for several moments with the blank journal resting beneath her fingertips. The smooth leather felt surprisingly warm, as though countless hands had once held volumes just like it before placing them upon the towering shelves surrounding them. She slowly opened the cover. The first page contained only a single sentence written in elegant handwriting. Every lasting legacy begins with a choice no one else considered important. She read the line twice before looking up. Who wrote this? Eleanor smiled softly. I did, nearly 200 years ago. Scarlett's eyes widened, but instead of disbelief, she found herself quietly accepting that the impossible had become almost ordinary inside this remarkable estate. She gently turned another page. The journal remained completely blank. You really expect me to write something in here? Eleanor nodded. Not tonight, perhaps not even this year. Stories should never be rushed. Sebastian rose from his chair and walked slowly toward one of the towering bookshelves overlooking the fireplace. He carefully removed an old leather volume whose edges had softened with age before placing it gently on the table beside Scarlett. Read the first page. Scarlett opened it carefully. The ink had faded slightly, yet every word remained beautifully preserved. It described a young schoolteacher who had once stayed after class every evening to tutor children whose parents could not afford private lessons. No statues had ever been built in her honor. No newspapers had written about her. Yet decades later, one of those children became a physician who established free clinics across 3 states, crediting everything to the patience of a teacher who had quietly refused to let him fail. Scarlett closed the book slowly. She never knew what happened afterward. "No," Sebastian answered. "Kindness rarely receives a complete ending from the person who begins it." Eleanor looked toward the endless shelves surrounding them. "That is why this library exists. Someone should remember." Scarlett suddenly understood why the journals had become Sebastian's favorite collection. They were not records of power, they were records of influence. The room fell peacefully silent again until a grandfather clock softly announced the passing hour. Scarlett glanced toward one of the tall windows where the first hints of dawn had begun to lighten the eastern horizon beyond the trees. "I should probably leave before my manager thinks I disappeared forever," she said with an embarrassed smile. "A very sensible concern." Sebastian nodded. "Your responsibilities remain important." Scarlett looked at him with genuine curiosity. "You are not going to ask me to stay?" he answered without hesitation. "No." She seemed surprised. "Why not?" He looked toward the brightening sky beyond the glass. "Because kindness that is freely given should never become a cage. The life you built before yesterday deserves the same respect as the person you proved yourself to be tonight." Those words touched Scarlett more deeply than any grand promise could have. Throughout the evening, no one had tried to change her. No one had offered wealth in exchange for loyalty. No one had suggested she abandon the ordinary world she loved. Instead, they had simply honored the values she already carried into it every day. Eleanor slowly stood and walked with Scarlett toward the library doors. Before they reached the hallway, she paused beside a small display case holding the silver ring Scarlett had briefly touched at the crosswalk. "You wondered about this?" Scarlett nodded. "I did." Eleanor lifted the ring carefully before placing it in Scarlett's open palm once more. This time, she did not take it back immediately. "This crest has represented our family for many generations," she explained. "Yesterday I wanted to know whether anyone would notice the woman wearing it before noticing the symbol itself." Scarlett studied the delicate engraving. It was beautiful, but now it seemed strangely insignificant compared to the memory of the hand that had rested on her arm while crossing the street. She smiled gently and returned the ring. "I am glad I noticed the person first." Eleanor's eyes glistened with quiet gratitude. "So am I." Sebastian opened the front doors himself as cool morning air drifted into the entrance hall. The first rays of sunlight stretched across the stone driveway while birds welcomed the new day from the surrounding cedar trees. Scarlett stepped outside before turning back one final time. "Thank you," she said sincerely, "for trusting me enough to tell me the truth." Sebastian offered the faint smile she had begun recognizing. "No, Miss Hayes." His calm voice carried softly into the morning air. "Thank you for reminding us why the truth was worth protecting in the first place." The bus ride back to Seattle felt almost dreamlike as the first light of morning spread across the skyline. Scarlett sat beside the window, watching familiar streets slowly come alive. Delivery trucks rolled toward neighborhood markets. Bakers unlocked storefronts. Office lights flickered on one floor at a time. Everything looked exactly as it had the day before, yet she no longer viewed the city in quite the same way. She reached Harbor Lane Diner a few minutes before 7 and quietly tied her green apron behind her back before anyone else arrived. The comforting smell of fresh coffee, toasted bread, and maple syrup filled the small restaurant exactly as it always had. Her manager greeted her with a tired smile. "Morning, Scarlett, busy breakfast ahead." She smiled back naturally, "Just the way we like it." Within minutes, the familiar rhythm returned. Coffee cups clinked against saucers. Orders were called through the kitchen window. Regular customers waved from their favorite booths. Nothing about the morning suggested that only hours earlier she had stood inside an ancient estate beside a king whose existence the outside world would never know. Around 8:30, the retired schoolteacher entered as always and settled onto the third stool at the counter. Scarlett poured her coffee before the woman even ordered it. "You remembered," the teacher said warmly. Scarlett smiled. Some things should never need reminding. A young father entered carrying a sleepy little girl while struggling with a stroller and 2 breakfast bags. Before he could apologize for blocking the entrance, another customer quietly stood and held the door open without being asked. An elderly veteran reached for the sugar dispenser only to discover another customer had already slid it gently toward him with a friendly smile. Scarlett noticed every one of those tiny moments. They had probably happened every day before. She had simply never understood how much they mattered. Less than 20 miles away, inside the estate hidden beyond the cedar trees, Sebastian stood before the library windows, watching the same sunrise spread across the distant city. Eleanor quietly joined him, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea. "You have been standing there for nearly an hour," she observed with gentle amusement. Sebastian accepted the cup without looking away from the skyline. Seattle smiled knowingly. "The city has not changed," he nodded slowly. "No, only my perspective has." She rested one hand lightly against his shoulder. That is how real lessons usually work. Later that afternoon, a carefully wrapped package arrived at Harbor Lane Diner addressed simply to Scarlett Hayes. Curious, she carried it into the employee break room before opening the plain brown paper. Inside rested the same blank journal Eleanor had shown her in the library. There was no expensive box, no elaborate decoration, only a handwritten note tucked inside the front cover: "Live exactly as you did before. The only difference is that now you know someone is preserving the stories that kindness creates." Scarlett smiled quietly before placing the journal inside her work locker, rather than taking it home immediately. She did not want it displayed on a shelf or treated like a trophy. It belonged among ordinary days because that was where its pages would eventually be earned. Weeks passed. Autumn slowly gave way to early winter. Scarlett never returned to the estate during that time, nor did anyone pressure her to do so. Instead, she continued serving coffee, carrying heavy trays, remembering regular customers by name, and helping strangers whenever life quietly placed them in her path. Every now and then a familiar black car could be seen parked discreetly across the street from the diner for only a few minutes before disappearing again. No one inside ever noticed except Scarlett once or twice, and even then she only smiled softly before returning to work. She understood now that gratitude did not always announce itself. Sometimes it simply watched from a respectful distance. One snowy evening after closing, Scarlett opened the blank journal for the very first time. She picked up a pen and looked at the empty page for several quiet moments before writing only one sentence. "Today a customer paid for another family's breakfast without telling anyone. I think that story deserves to be remembered." She closed the journal with a peaceful smile, never realizing that before sunrise the following morning, her simple entry would already have found its place among the greatest collection of ordinary kindness the hidden court had spent centuries protecting. Winter gradually surrendered to spring, and Seattle awakened beneath longer mornings filled with pale sunlight reflecting across rain-washed streets. Life continued exactly as Scarlett had always hoped it would. She still arrived at Harbor Lane Diner before sunrise. She still remembered regular customers by name. She still carried heavy coffee pots with the same quiet smile that expected nothing in return. The only difference was invisible to everyone around her. She no longer wondered whether small acts of kindness mattered. She knew they did. Months after the extraordinary evening at the hidden estate, Scarlett finished another breakfast shift and stepped outside with a paper cup of coffee warming her hands. The city moved with its familiar rhythm. Office workers hurried toward downtown buildings. Cyclists weaved through traffic. School buses stopped every few blocks as children climbed aboard carrying oversized backpacks. It looked like an ordinary morning. Then she noticed an elderly couple standing at the same crosswalk where everything had begun. The husband leaned carefully on a wooden cane while his wife held his arm, both waiting patiently as impatient cars continued rushing through the intersection. Without thinking, Scarlett crossed the sidewalk toward them. "Would you like a hand?" she asked warmly. The older man smiled with grateful eyes. "We would appreciate that very much." She offered her arm exactly as she had months before, allowing them to choose the pace while traffic patiently waited for the light to change. They reached the opposite sidewalk together, exchanging simple smiles before continuing on their way. Scarlett watched them disappear into the morning crowd before turning to continue toward the diner. That was when she saw him. Sebastian stood quietly across the street wearing a simple charcoal overcoat instead of formal black attire. No attendants surrounded him. No ceremonial hall framed his presence. No title separated him from the ordinary city waking around them. He looked less like a ruler than a man enjoying the first warm morning after a long winter. Scarlett crossed the street with an amused smile. "You planned that, did not you?" Sebastian shook his head gently. "No." He glanced toward the elderly couple now walking peacefully beneath flowering trees. "But I suspected you would not walk past them." Scarlett laughed softly. "Apparently I am becoming predictable." "I hope not," he answered. "I simply hope you never stop being yourself." They began walking together without destination, following quiet sidewalks lined with blooming cherry trees, while morning sunlight filtered through fresh green branches overhead. For the first time since they had met, there was no ceremony waiting for them, no hidden tradition to explain, and no mystery left unresolved. Only two people sharing an ordinary conversation in an ordinary city. Scarlett eventually looked toward him with thoughtful curiosity. "Does your court still preserve stories?" Sebastian smiled. "Every day, even tiny ones, especially tiny ones." She looked around at strangers greeting neighbors, parents helping children cross the street, and volunteers opening the doors of a neighborhood food pantry preparing for the day's visitors. "Then your library must already be much larger than when I first saw it." Sebastian followed her gaze. "It grows because people like you never realize someone is paying attention." Scarlett stopped walking for a moment. "I think I finally understand something." He waited patiently. "The greatest stories are probably not the ones everyone talks about." She smiled gently. "They are the ones that quietly change another person's day." Sebastian nodded with unmistakable agreement. "And sometimes they quietly change a king." They continued walking until they reached the familiar intersection once more. Traffic lights changed from red to green. Morning commuters hurried in every direction. Nothing about the crossing appeared extraordinary, yet everything felt different now. Months earlier, one young waitress had paused because an elderly woman needed help. Today, two people stepped forward together as another elderly pedestrian hesitated at the curb. Neither asked for recognition, neither expected gratitude. They simply offered an arm and crossed the street at the pace kindness required. Above them, the city continued exactly as before, unaware that one ordinary decision had quietly transformed lives on both sides of a hidden world. And somewhere beyond the cedar trees, inside a library filled not with tales of power but with stories of compassion, another blank page waited patiently for the next simple act that someone else might have overlooked.